Let's not waste any time. It's now day 4 of the siege. On the first day of February, Korean supplies were finally delivered from Gyeongju. Now, with supplies in hand, Young Hao decided to let his men take the day off and rest. However, he ordered the Korean commander-in-chief Gwon Yul to continue the attack and also to fill in any water wells near Dosan Fortress. Gwon Yul agreed to this and gave orders to attack. The Korean soldiers approached cautiously, holding their wooden shields high. The plan was to stack up the firewood gathered days before at the base of the fortress and then set it on fire. The Japanese defenders, though, once again let loose a wall of bullets, which caused the Korean attackers to suffer severe losses. This caused the army to begin to panic. Gwon Yul then executed several Joseon officials to restore order in the army. Yul then led the army personally. Once again, the concentrated fire of the Japanese guns cut through the army, and the Koreans were forced to retreat. Now, while this attack was happening, a Japanese relief force arrived from Sosanpo on the outskirts of Ulsan and met with another Japanese flotilla coming in from Yeonpo. They would combine their forces together and then try to give the defenders at Tosan more supplies through the waterways. Lee Rumei would catch on though and ordered his men to fire any available cannons and rockets at the ships in the water. There was a back and forth for quite a while when one of the Japanese ships started to take on water. They then decided to retreat. Yang Hao, meanwhile, sent his messenger once again to try and get the Japanese to surrender. This time though, the messenger shouted at a distance so that the entire garrison could hear him and promised them rewards. One soldier actually did leave. Yang Hao was incredibly happy by this and gave the man a horse and paraded him outside the walls in sight of all the Japanese defenders. Kato Kiyomasa in response blocked off the exits just in case, and I wouldn't be surprised if he actually had men executed. The weather turned suddenly. Heavy rain and wind battered the Ming soldiers in the camp, causing many of them to become sick. February 2nd. It was continuing to downpour, turning many of the fields into deep swamps. Around 8 a.m., another Japanese flotilla arrived from Yeonpo once again to reinforce the defenders. Yang Hao and Ma Gui in response took control of the armies and commanded the Joseon army to surround the fortress to prevent the Japanese from breaking through. While this happened, about a third of the Ming army went to the riverbank to try to stop the Japanese reinforcements, and were then joined by the elite Zhejiang infantry. The two sides took turns shooting at each other. After a while, the Japanese decided that their casualties were just plain unacceptable and retreated. Watching their reinforcements being forced to retreat once again was incredibly demoralizing for the Japanese defenders, and they were starting to think about entering into negotiations with the Ming. Kato Kiyomasa's retainer, Minabu Kihachiro, put out a letter inside the fortress. In it, the letter tried to say that Kiyomasa was still at Sosanpo and that officials should travel with him there so that they could discuss peace. It was of course a lie. Yang Hao offered that if Kato Kiyomasa would surrender, he would be rewarded. Neither side was going to compromise though. After this, Yang Hao held a meeting with his commanders to discuss what their next course of action should be. He then ordered Joseon soldiers that weren't currently fighting to go out and forage for food for the Ming soldiers. At Hatsongsan, Ma Gui and himself would oversee construction of thatched roof shelters so that the men could finally have some shelter from the elements. The Korean army then did a probing attack against the Sanomaru of the Tosan fortress. Kato Yoseimon, who was in charge of its defense, had his men put up bundles of bamboo, and from behind them commanded his matchlock men to fire in rank. The Joseon troops were forced to retreat, but actually had managed to pile up firewood at the base. They hoped that once the rain had let up, that they would actually be able to set fire to this section. Yang Hao would once again attempt to negotiate with the Japanese. But once again, the talks just didn't lead to anything. Then, later in the night, Kado Yoseimon and Kondo Goemon would attempt to raid the Ming camp. This failed though because once again the camp was heavily guarded. They did manage, however, to burn a good bit of their firewood though, to get rid of it. On February 3rd, the rain finally started to die down. Japanese sources say that in the early hours, the Ming deployed heavy cannons at Haksongsan to destroy the walls. In reality, these were probably much smaller anti-personnel cannons, but they're still deadly. Several Japanese soldiers were said to have run for cover at such a barrage. They would then be stopped by none other than Kado Kiyomasa himself. It's said that this barrage didn't remotely faze him, even though some of the cannon shots landed near him, and even managed to hit one of his personal bodyguards, leaving behind only his legs. This lack of reaction made the Ming artillerymen change their trajectory, which caused them to miss their next round of shots. They would continue missing from there. The Japanese responded by firing back using their ozutsu. According to Ming sources, they came close to hitting Yang Hao, but he was equally unfazed. Now it should be noted that there's actually a big possibility that neither of these, or just one of the events, happened, and that it was just propaganda. Just keep that in mind. In a similar assault, the same as the day before, the Joseon tried once again to attack Ulsan. Once again, though, they were repelled with a barrage of lead. Then, at around 11 a.m., another flotilla appeared. These were different, though, as the banners that these ships flew weren't Kado Kiyomasa's, but instead were of Yamaguchi, Muninaga, and Mori Katsunobu. New reinforcements were on the way. They communicated to the defenders using flags, and then left to report back to Sosanpo. Just seeing that new help was on the way lifted the spirits of the defenders. At around 6 p.m., forces under the commands of Kuroda Nagamasa, Takanaka Shigetoshi, and Anakochi Eiki arrived at Sosanpo and prepared to relieve the defenders. By nightfall, the heavy rains had stopped, only to be replaced by strong icy winds. These conditions hurt the Ming soldiers, especially the ones stationed near the river. Once midnight had hit, 100 mounted samurai and hundreds of matchlock men left out of the eastern gate of the Ninomaru. They shot fire arrows and released volleys of matchlock fire against the Ming camp on the east side of Ulsan before quickly turning back before the Ming could respond. And this is where I will leave you, the Japanese persisting behind their walls, despite continuous attacks. The Ming keeping the Japanese flotillas in check, and the conditions coming down on the Ming. The siege isn't over yet though, and I'll see you next time.